Yeah, great. Okay, my name's Dr. Preiksaitis. I'm from the Department of Emergency Medicine, and today I want to talk about how the science of motivation can improve your teaching strategies. First of all, we need to talk about some definitions. What is motivation? Well, one definition from the research is why people think and behave as they do. And this has to do with internal factors as well as environmental factors around an individual person. Why is this important? Well, in my specialty, emergency medicine, and in medicine in general, we're experiencing an epidemic of burnout. And it turns out that motivation tends to be a fair antidote to burnout. People that report high levels of motivation tend to be more inspired, have higher levels of well-being, and lower levels of depression than people that report low levels of motivation. So what can we do to improve learner motivation? Well, in motivation science, the classic framework is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I included this because every education talk needs some sort of pyramid diagram of some sort. But basically this says that you need to have your basic needs met, your physiologic needs like air, water, food, before you can move on to be motivated to achieve anything higher like love and belonging or even self-actualization. But since Maslow, motivation science has moved on to a couple of other theories that are more salient to education. The first one of these is self-theories of ability. And we know this in the education space as the difference between a fixed versus a growth mindset. The second is achievement goal theory. And this basically states that people are motivated by proximity to a certain goal. And in education, this is often talked about in terms of assessments or some sort of formative or summative evaluation. And then the final one is self-determination theory, which I want to focus on because I think it has the most relevant applications for the educational environment. Self-determination theory explains the social conditions that either promote or inhibit people's motivation. It posits that human beings are naturally creative creatures that like learning, like exploring, like engaging in creative activities, and engaging in social interaction that we integrate into a cohesive sense of self. Self-determination theory also talks about how motivation exists on a spectrum. This has sort of made it into popular culture, so I'm sure you've heard of this before, but it ranges from amotivation, where somebody doesn't want to engage in something, to extrinsic motivation, where people will do something based on some sort of external pressure, either a reward or punishment. And then the highest level, which we should aspire to, is intrinsic motivation, where people want to do something because they find it inherently fulfilling. So our goal as educators should be to try and move our students to that level of intrinsic motivation, a higher level of motivation where they're actually engaged to do something just because they find it enjoyable. But the real challenge is, how do we go about doing that? Self-determination theory can also help with this. It posits that people's motivation is dependent on three specific social constructs. And these are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So I'm going to talk about each of these and how we can use some educational strategies to enhance these elements and hopefully inspire greater motivation in our learners. What is autonomy? Autonomy is basically the idea of having agency in what you want to learn and what you want to do, rather than feeling pressured or coerced. Competence is achieved when you feel a sense of accomplishment for struggling to do something, so some sort of difficult task or mastering a particular skill. And then relatedness is feeling a sense of human connection and really having your basic needs met by feeling valued and seen by the rest of the community. So the question is, how can we bring these three topics into our educational environment in a way to inspire learner motivation? In the literature, there's a teaching strategy that's called autonomy supportive teaching that takes these strategies from self-determination theory and moves them into the educational space. Autonomy supportive teaching also encompasses using ideas of competence and relatedness, so it's probably better thought of as self-determination theory informed teaching, but that's a big mouthful, so I would probably just think of this as motivational teaching strategies. I'm going to go through each of the concepts and go through some basic ideas that you could potentially apply in your learning environments to help learners feel a little bit more motivated. The first one is autonomy. So how can we inspire autonomy? You can first provide choices. So if there are options for what your learners need to study, you have a variety of different content areas, you can give some options for how they want to study and what particular educational modalities they want to go into. This also comes into picking, like our previous speakers talked about, picking a final project and having options. It gives some autonomy for deciding what you actually want to work on, and that increases motivation. The second one is minimizing external pressure. So we know that, as I mentioned, external motivators, like putting rewards or punishments on a particular type of behavior, sometimes that's necessary. You need somebody to just do something, so you want to put a little incentive there, or you want to put a stick to make sure they do their homework. But we know from the research space that the more and more external pressures we put on people to complete tasks, that undermines the development of that intrinsic motivation. So if you're going to do that, try and do that sparingly. And then finally, encouraging self-reflection. Self-reflection and self-assessment are really the key elements that will make learners take better ownership over their own learning process and help develop that intrinsic motivation that we should aspire towards. The next one is competence. So how can we inspire competence in our learners? The first thing we can do is we can give honest feedback. And feedback can be given in a way that supports learner autonomy by asking people what they want specific feedback on. I do this with learners in the emergency department often. I start shifts asking what they want me to give them feedback on and give them some choices. And then I allow them some options if I encounter problems to try and figure out how to solve their problems on their own, rather than providing them definitive solutions, allowing them to work through their own challenges. The second one is setting optimal levels of challenge. This is basically setting people up for success. And this is a challenging, for me, this is a challenging thing to do. In the emergency department, I think about this as picking correct patient scenarios for people to work with. I don't want to put an amateur learner in with a very sick trauma patient because they're going to feel discouraged and incapable. But I also need to check in with my learners to make sure I'm not holding them back from situations where they can really feel challenged and grow. So really titrating the level of challenge to what's appropriate for a particular learner. And then finally, coaching through problems. So this ties into giving feedback. Rather than providing definitive solutions for how somebody should solve a problem they encounter, coach them through that problem and allow them to figure out the solutions on their own so that they're going to feel that sense of accomplishment for working through something hard rather than just going and getting the answer. And then finally, relatedness. And the key with relatedness is really acknowledging the basic human needs of your learners. Providing appropriate support and cultivating an environment that allows learners to feel valued and feel safe to be their authentic selves and show some vulnerability is really valuable in the educational environment. And you can imagine that if you're trying to assess whether somebody has a knowledge gap or what they need more training on, if they're not willing to feel vulnerable and expose that, it's going to be really hard to make that assessment. So some ways that you can go about doing this are by using empathetic listening. For me, this translates into, rather than just saying that's wrong, that's the incorrect answer, trying to ascertain how they came to that answer and get a better understanding of the reasoning behind that process, and really trying to engage with respect. Particularly for me, this is challenging because I work in a very busy environment, so really devoting that time to show that I'm actually listening to my learners is a challenge, but it really makes a difference to them. The second one is making learners feel valued. So giving praise that's meaningful and acknowledging contributions. It's a small thing, but we often forget to give some praise for a job well done. Again, working in the clinical environment is very busy, and medical students can often feel overlooked. So really taking the time to acknowledge when they've done something well and doing it in a way that is meaningful and not patronizing can really be valuable. And then finally, demonstrating your own empathy and humility. I mentioned creating a safe space and allowing learners to be vulnerable. We as educators should also be vulnerable and allow ourselves to open up about challenges that we've experienced and acknowledge that we are still growing and learning and have things we don't know. And that's really going to create a learning process that's more of a two-way street rather than a hierarchy. And that will increase sort of that sense of partnership and trying to find solutions and learn as a team rather than one person teaching another person. So in summary, learner motivation can affect well-being and achievement. It's not just getting people motivated to complete tasks, it actually has a major benefit in terms of their sense of well-being and self. Self-determination theory provides a framework for us to understand motivation and also outlines some particular concepts that we can focus on in our teaching to help improve learner motivation. Those are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And then autonomy supportive teaching or motivational teaching offers some potential strategies to optimize these factors. So remember that learner motivation is not just about having them complete a certain task, it's really to benefit their own well-being and make them enjoy the learning experience much more. Thank you.